Right.
Okay, we're live.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another QAHN session devoted to Indigenous history and heritage. This is the third in the series that we've been running this summer, kind of as a consolation for having had to cancel our conference in April and in October. So, on behalf of our member historical societies and our museums across Quebec, our members, QAHN is pleased to bring you this today's presentation by Eric Pouliot-Thisdale. Eric is an historian and a researcher of Mohawk Innu ancestry, whose recent work has focused on military and demographic archives. Eric is frequently called on by First Nations communities across Quebec to carry out genealogical research. He's written and published a number of articles and academic papers that deal with several topics in Indigenous history. In fact, Quebec Heritage News magazine will feature an article by Eric in our fall edition that examines the origin of Mohawk settlements in New France. Today's presentation is based on Eric's analysis of demographic records that has helped to identify Indigenous veterans of the War of 1812 and 1815. Welcome, Eric. I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Dwayne. So, hi, everybody. It was great, by the way, to see Darren and Kevin's dear's previous videos. So, very good motion by the Historical Society. So, I'm currently concluding my bachelor in history at University of Quebec in Montreal, and I've been conducting since about 20 years various researches for band councils, some for territorial purposes, certain litigious situation in court presently, uh, as well as some demographical analysis. I mostly analyzed the censuses of Kahnawake, Akwesasne, and Kanehsatake from the first censuses, the official censuses from 1825 until 1921. And I conducted a genealogical, well, mostly a demographical analysis of those populations, job-wise, gender-wise, and so on. And the modifications through the jurisdictions from the missions to the creation of reserves in 1851. So I ended up transcribing the whole ministerial correspondences about the creation of reserves in Lower Canada, and it opened many other researches. So I have about 30 researches online on my website. It's if you just type Eric Pouliot-Thisdale on Google, it'll pop out in one of the on the first page, quite probably, usually. So uh, I was hired concerning the War of 1812 in 2012, 2013. Actually, in 2012, Harper made a huge promotion of the War of 1812, of a great Canadian battle. And the Native Affairs, Stephen Harper, through the Native Affairs, hired various researchers from Native communities throughout Canada to associate those who were granted medals or took part in the various militias in Lower and Upper Canada. I focused mine to search the warriors that took part in it from Kahnawake and Kanehsatake and some from Akwesasne. But it turned out that once you open those microfilms from the military archives, you end up meaning all those mostly who took part in it from the St. Lawrence valleys, from all the missions and the communities, so the Abenakis, the Hurons, and so on. So the little book, that's the research that I published on the slide there. Uh, it was re-edited by Kanehsatake for the school board. So for secondary 2 and 3, it's included in the history classes. A little guide on the those who took part in the War of 1812. On that slide, you see yeah, exactly. Sorry. On Voila. Voila is the new website since last year for researchers to publish their own publications and researches. So I got 30 online actually right now. Basically, as I was saying, they were about the transcriptions of the censuses and the analysis of population. I put one online, as you see on the image, from 1886 to 1800, the Old Commission and Parish Register from Kanehsatake. This was actually conducted in order to associate those who received medals that took part in the War of 1812. So I transcribed the whole parish registers in order to observe if the names on those who received medals were associable with those from the parish register. So beside the census analysis and the War of 1812, I did a few of the residential schools, the pupils that attended, because the Mohawks and the Abenakis being conducted by Anglophone missions to a certain extent. In 1890 to 1921, they were sent to the Ontario residential school, which were the first one around Sault Ste. Marie. Because in Quebec, for the Inuit, the Algonquians, and the French-speaking missions, let's say, they started mostly in around 1940-42. But previously, all those from Kanehsatake, Kahnawake, and some Abenakis, originally from New England and so on, spoke English. So the kids were sent from 1890 to 1920 in residence. I did a lot on, for instance, a black slave that was adopted in Kahnawake and so on. So there's a lot on the creation of reserves, on the anniversary of Montreal, so a little history about the history of Montreal, and the Métis claims, which became very, very popular in Quebec. People claiming native ancestors from far gone, from 1600 to 1800. So a study had to be conducted on this behalf. It was getting very popular. So on the next slide, the origins of the War of 1812. Actually, the Napoleonic War that started in the early 19th century in Europe between England and France, of course, the Napoleonic era, they were mostly managing, they had imperial control on most of the land in Europe, while the English started, well, they were relying more and more on the colonies and the market through the sea. So the ocean was controlled by the English and the lands by Bonaparte, in Europe mostly. So various clashes started occurring, and in the States, what made it start, it's on June 22nd, 1807, an English vessel called the Leopard, in search of British deserters, attacked an American ship and inspected it. So 3 Americans died as a result. Irritation started between the United States, and the United States actually started prohibiting vessels from trading through the European continent, with the European continent. So the Americans actually adopted a non-importation law, and they decreed an embargo prohibiting access to American ports to foreign negotiators and traders from Europe, mostly from England. So that's what really bursted the first flames to start the War of 1812, so in 1807. So on the next slide, the other slide, those Indigenous warriors and British soldiers who took part in the militias from Upper and Lower Canada, they had to wait until 1848 before they did receive medals. So, of course, many passed away when the were given, and actually it was 1847 and 1848. That was an omission from my part. So, to recognize the contribution of both in the Indigenous militia and the Lower and Upper Canada militias, commemorative banners and medals were given to 48 actual communities, Native communities and Métis communities. So on the next slide. So as I previously mentioned, in order to associate those in the list of those who received medals, those remainers that were still alive, I did analyze, I really focused most likely on Kahnawake and Kanehsatake. So from the period from 1786 to 1851, I analyzed censuses, parish registers, and military correspondences. And later on, if I would have found that earlier, I noticed that through the archives of Quebec BANQ, on their website, they have all the newspapers archives, a lot from Ontario and Quebec. And there's actually the archives from 1847 when they're talking about the medals being given and stuff. And many people that passed away from those communities, they're mentioned that they were veterans of the war, and they don't appear in the list of those who received medals. So most historians throughout various previous books and researches, they mostly all associated the Lower Canada warrior militia to only Kahnawake, usually in books until the last editions of the last years. They mostly only mention Kahnawake, those from Kahnawake. Though once those parish registers and censuses and so on are analyzed, we realized that there were actually Algonquians and so on. Because actually in Oka, Kanehsatake, in the mission, since the Algonquians were 9 months a year, they were nomads, and they came about 2 months a year. So they were registered in Kanehsatake and Oka, though there were a lot in between Témiscamingue and Val-d'Or. So they only came 2 months a year, but they were registered from the Oka mission, even though they were only 9 months. So on the next slide, is exposing, as I was saying, that not only Mohawks took part in the militia, but Abenakis of Saint François, the Algonquians, which were registered in Kanehsatake, Oka, they were in most military archives. They say the Algonquians of Ottawa. They were from Ottawa River to Témiscamingue to Val-d'Or, actually, since they were nomads. Those from the Saint Maurice, they were actually at Tikanek, qualified as Algonquians, and most previous researches on those who took part in the War of 1812. And the Abenakis of Saint François and Bécancour. So in all, they were supervised by 100 officers from Lower and Upper Canada. And they had to wear a proper uniform, being in the militia. Though it's a little bit speculative once in a while, because we have various paintings and drawings, and they look pretty much the same, but many vary as well. So it's a little bit speculative to associate the dressing of the warriors. Actually, there's what's very interesting is that those who were in the warrior militia, the Abenakis, as I was mentioning, the Odanak, Bécancour, the Hurons of Lorette, Kahnawake, Akwesasne, Kanehsatake, they're actually part of the first alliance all those from the St. Lawrence Valley had with the King of France. They were qualified as the Seven Nations. And they remained an alliance until 1760, when the French regime was taken over. Though the Seven Nation organization of all those from the St. Lawrence Mission, they then annexed with with the English. So they were still qualified as the Seven Nations until around 1848, 47, the last medals they got. And then they created the reserves, and oops, the Seven Nations were somehow diluted. We never really heard about the Seven Nations after that. Yeah, so that's the plate, the commemorating original contribution in the War of 1812. That we can see this plate is on a statue that's in Kahnawake in front of the Saint Xavier Church, Saint Francois Xavier Church, and they also have behind that statue they have one about concerning those who took part in the First, Second War of Vietnam, War of Korea. They were very involved, and it's actually called the Legion Branch 219. So those that took part in the battles of Detroit, Chrysler Farm, and Chateauguay are on that plate, and it's very interesting. It's a very nice statue, and it was put forward on June 2013 by the Legion Branch. So. We can see the names, how they were spelled back then, and it's very, very interesting because it was very phonetic. And back then, the missionaries were the Jesuits, French speaking, and around 1812, many people switched towards the United Church. Back then, it was the Methodists. And since it was a French mission, many went back to their contacts with the families in Akwesasne on the New York side and so on in Ontario. So English came back as a fluent language spoken. So back then, people were baptized Charles, Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste became John, and Jean-Baptiste, the way people spelled it, the Mohawk Soundex pronunciation of Jean-Baptiste is Sawatis. Sawatis Jean-Baptiste. Charles was Saro. Wiche was Michel, which became Mike. Ignace, which is Ignace in French, became Angus, of course, in English. Wiche Michel. Roren was for Laurent, Lawrence. Roui for Louis. Lazare, Razar, Ignace, Angus. Saskari was Zachary, but he was potentially Angus Zachary. Arené for René. Atonsa was usually Atonwa with an 8 soundex vocal phonetic, the way they pronounce the W. So Atonwa was later spelled Atonsa. Sac for Jacques, somehow Jacques, A.K. James for some. Pierre was for Pierre, for Peter. Dion, Trio, and so on. So there's quite a few written down. So that's how the names were spelled back then. And people didn't have any family names back in the days. They only had a name. And often what happened, for instance, if the name Gabriel, the family name now that's Gabriel, that's Simon, were before they were the first name given at the baptism by the missionaries. Let's say it was Simon Onasakenrat. Well, when he passed away, Simon Onasakenrat, the kids took his first name as a family name. So Simon, which was the first name, became the family name. And so on for the Gabriel and for the Zachary, Lazare, and so on. So that's how they initiated the first names. And it happened a lot in the first wave of the kids sent in residential schools in Ontario. While the kids were in residential school, they had traditional names. In that period, the names were modified by the missionaries and the Indian agents. Perhaps they worked together for that purpose to annihilate the Indian in the Indians. So, nonetheless, between 1880 to 1921, the English and French foreigners were incorporated in the Mohawk. So, yeah, oops, there was a monument remaining. Exactly, yeah. Sorry about that. You had it. Yeah, that was good. The slide about the monument. So a monument reminding of the Battle of Chateauguay, which actually occurred in Ormstown, was supposed to be a vernissage, somehow a presentation of new findings. Those who took part in the mission in the war of the Battle of Chateauguay, which actually occurred in Ormstown. So me and a few other researchers, we found actually all those who took part in the warrior militia from the various 7 nations along the St. Lawrence River, some Abenakis, some Algonquians, and so on. It was supposed to be exposed this spring, but with the virus, it's going to be postponed to an unknown date yet. But stay tuned; it should happen pretty soon. So, yeah, uh, those from those missions, the Iroquois of Kahnawake, of St. Regis, Nipissings and Algonquians of registered at 2 mountains, even though they were mostly up and down low. Abenakis of St. Francois took part in the Battle of Queenston, in Odotown, in Chateauguay, and Beaver Dam. And they're listed, most of them are listed on those who received medals, those alive back then. I just forgot to mention that the corpse of savages, as it was depicted, it was created by the superintendent, Sir John Johnson. He was actually qualified as superintendent inspector general, Sir John Johnson, and the superintendent Charles Michel de Salaberry actually managed the Lower Canada militia, which was called the Voltigeurs. So in the Battle of Detroit, Major Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh, and Mohawk Chief John Norton and John Brandt, and 80 Mohawks and Delawares managed to win that Battle of Detroit. 1,000 Americans in Upper Canada were brought down, went back down to the States. Then the old Odotown, I didn't do much on Odotown. I won't speculate on that. The Battle of Chateauguay, which we'll see further. And the Beaver Dams from June 24th, 1813, is from which the Laura Séquard romantic history is all about. If you Google Laura Séquard War of 1812, you'll have plenty of stuff to read. It was very romanticized back then. It was very promotional. So when the Michel de Salaberry, he was managing the detachment of the Voltigeurs, and the Battle of Chateauguay occurred on October 26th. Though he was a little bit uncomfortable about the way certain warriors took prisoners, how they killed certain prisoners. So Voltigeurs, he put the emphasis that he wanted the captives to be kept alive. So on this letter, I'm just gonna just gonna read a little bit of that letter, the first paragraph. It's exposing that on the first paragraph, the officers commanding the several nations of Indians are directed to encourage the warriors in seeking after the scattered Americans who are lost in the woods and to exercise mercy towards them. They must again be informed of the reward which government gives for each prisoner brought by them. So obviously, then put the emphasis on keeping all the prisoners alive as much as possible. So when the Voltigeur militia was created from 1815, April 1812, the conditions for organizing that militia was exposed in 18 topics. As it starts, for instance, the first discorps to consist of His Majesty's subject born in Canada to be raised to serve during the apprehension with the United States of America or actual what with the country. On the next slide, we see the 18th. It's called an additional company formed of Indians will be allowed to be attached to this court, consisting of 6 chiefs and 60 warriors. This company will be armed, clothed after their own manner. I added this. Oh no, they wrote that. And victualled, meaning fed, that's I add this one, at the expense of the government. They will receive presents as a reward instead of pay. So what actually happened, they were called the either tri-monthly or bi-monthly. They gave gifts to the families of the warriors who took part in the wars since 1763 up to the War of 1812. And it kept on going when the Patriot 1837-38. So the families of warriors kept on receiving gifts, tomahawks, clothing, all sorts of conveniences like that. And when they created the reserves in 1851, it started to become too much for the government to keep on giving, and which was a big part of the creation of reserves. They wanted the communities to bring some income somehow through agriculture, which brought to the creation of reserves mostly. They didn't want people to. There wasn't much fur to be hunted anymore. It wasn't as productive as it was previously. A lot less fur, so they really motivated people towards agriculture. So the creation of reserves. So donations ended, we could say, in the period of the creation of reserves, mostly. So on the other, yeah. So the medals awarded to warriors in 1847, those that were still alive who did receive the medals were the Battle of Detroit, Battle of Chateauguay, and Chrysler Farm. So on the next slide, the list of those who received medals on the military archives microfilms, it was initiated with that those first leaflets, and it writes alphabetical list of Canadian militia and Indian warriors whose claims for medals for cooperation with the British troops at the action of Detroit, Chateauguay, and Chrysler Farm have been investigated by the Board of Canadian Officers at Montreal under the General Orders of the 25th August 1847. So on the next slide, sorry, we can see how the 4 columns are organized. We have the names, the rank, the actions, meaning either Detroit, Chateauguay, or Chrysler, and the date of action, which was the date of the war. So I transcribed, that's how I managed to transcribe all the names and get used to the handwritings. Because when you actually do transcribing, it's pretty good to get used to the handwritings conducted. So if we step on the other slide, so there were about 10 pages of the European, let's say Canadian European militia, and then started the Canadian list of warriors from the native communities, and how I could associate them with through analyzing and comparing through the parish registers and the names through years that made more sense. For instance, one is called Saro Arenhokta, and I noticed that Saro went for Charles, Ara Okta, Arenhokta, pretty much similar. So he was married on October 23, 1812, which absolutely made sense. Then there's Inyas Atenhara. Inyas was actually Inyas. Usually it used to be Angus. Inyas in the Mohawk phonetic. So he was married on November 23rd, 1813. So when I was hired at first to do the research by the Council of Kanehsatake, funded by Patrimony Canada and Park Canada, the main focus was to find those from Kanehsatake. Though, since the Sulpicians and the relationship between the Sulpicians and the Mohawks were not very, very good, the Sulpicians most likely tried to be evasive on the mission, and those from Two Mountains, Kanehsatake, somehow from Lake Ontario to New York to Lake and Two Mountains, the tip of Lake of Two Mountains was mostly to establish diplomatic relationships on the St. Lawrence River with Algonquians, Nipissings, and so on, with Abenakis. So they were very focused on diplomatic relationships and didn't really want to intermingle too much in the War of 1812, which is until now the best speculation why they didn't really take that much part in the militia in the War of 1812. Those from Kanehsatake. Those from Kanehsatake are very linked, a lot more with those from Akwesasne. If we do like the genealogies and the follow-ups from a census to another, there's a lot from Kanehsatake to Mountains that we can't really associate with Akwesasne or Kahnawake. They've been there for a long, long time, and they're potentially the roots of those speculate as being the Iroquois of Saint Laurent. Some say they vanished. Perhaps they're those that are linked with Two Mountains. A lot of speculations and unanswered questions up to now. So Dominique Duchamp, he was a French Canadian, previously a fur trader, who was well known. Actually, I have a little document on Dominique Duchamp. He was a fur trader with his father back then, Western fur trade, and around 1793, he paid 2 barrels of rum to buy lands on the Fox River in Wisconsin, and so on. So he was part of that era of fur trading and making questionable deals for native lands. Though he married the daughter of Delorimier, who was the Nicolas Guillaume Delorimier. He was the Indian agent of Kahnawake. And Agathe Delorimier was part native. So Dominique Duchamp married a part native girl, Agathe Delorimier. And they had kids together. They lived in Two Mountains, actually. So he was qualified as the captain of the militia from the Lake of Two Mountains. So it's very interesting to see that relationships between Kahnawake and Kanehsatake, the Indian agents and so on, they were all intermingled, and eventually those from Kahnawake and from Akwesasne are eventually linked as well. So on the census of 1851, we can see he's called Dominic Sham, Captain, Department of Indian. So, probably from his exposition from the militia, which he always kept. But after the War of 1812, we don't really hear much about Dominic Sham. He was pretty retreated, and but still he kept that title in all the censuses. And he passed away in 1857. So that's for Dominic Sham. Also, he had his father was named Dominic Sham. His real name was François. His father was called Dominic Sham. He eventually took the name Dominic, and he also had a brother called Dominic. So going through the military archives, it's eventually pretty confusing, but there's a lot of very precise documents. So everybody's able to associate them. Though before the Voltigeur militia, in which he was entitled for Kanehsatake, he took part in various militias as his brother and father, so it is quite confusing before that. Though, so on this, in order to associate those who received medals, besides not only the parish registers, but the censuses were analyzed. And for instance, Pierre Thiora-Quinte, sound X Pierre, Mohawk Warriors. I wrote Oka, even though Oka, by the way, just to mention that Oka was called Paul Oka. He was an Algonquian. He passed away around 1881, something like that. And the village was called Oka between 1880 and 1890. And now we're in 1812, 1814. But it was just to associate for everybody. So his name recorded in the censuses of 1825 and 1842. 1842, Pierre, that's okay. Thiora-Quinte. Thiora-Quinte. So that makes sense. And on the 1825 census, also of the Kanehsatake Two Mountains, Thiora-Quinte. So that's how we could really associate them. Because there wasn't like many Thiora-Quinte. He was really the only one in that period. So on the other slide, we see they were all written, fortunately, on the list of those who received medals in alphabetical order. So it was pretty much how we conducted. So there was only two in that list that are associable with Two Mountains. All the others are mentioned in Kahnawake. Though what was confusing in those years, some people moved sometimes from a village mission to another. Maybe stay 2 years there, 3 years there, and so on. So it's to a certain extent a little bit speculative. Some might have been a witness or a godfather in a baptism, but still was living in the other mission, and he was just visiting his family. So sometimes it's speculative to associate people, unless it's repetitive from a census to another. So those, as I was talking previously about the dresses of the warriors, that's the picture we have from most historians through the descriptions from the depicted in military correspondences and so on. Though perhaps they didn't have a double, so sometimes they had to dress as they could. So, but still, that's pretty much the image of that was given from most archives and so on. This one, yeah, the flag. This flag, it was also on the previous statue that we saw. I scanned various microfilms, documents, and archives, and it was only approved on October 2010. So it didn't really appear previously. There are collections of flags about military flags and so on. This one I never seen previously before, really, but it appeared on the website of Library and Archives Canada, to Military Archives, and it was put on the statue in Kahnawake in front of the St. Xavier Church, on the where all the names of those who took part were mentioned. So those killed and wounded, that was in Beaver Dam, 24 June 1813. Very interesting military archives. Though the only problem is that orthographic wise, they are misspelled, because those who were working in the military health service or at the rescue teams or the responsible then, they didn't know the people personally. They wrote the names how they heard it, sound wise. So it was pretty much a big fiasco. Trying to associate them with the censuses was pretty speculative to a certain extent, but going sound wise, syllable by syllable, there's a few that were associable. So some from Kahnawake here. For instance, Maurice, Chief Maurice, there was plenty of Maurice. Kanehsatake. There was only one that appeared in 1851, 61, sorry. So was he alive? Was it this one? Very speculative. Those from Akwesasne, also harshly written. There's only one that was associable potentially into the 1825 census. Two from Kanehsatake, though, were associable. On the other page, these are names of wounded shown in those military health correspondences. Some were a little bit more depicted, their situation. Haren Kendiaki, Chief Kanen Rekawa. I'm not speaking Mohawk, so very complex to pronounce. And the way they were written also. So Chief Sharp John in the elbow. Probably he was wounded in the elbow on July 17th near Niagara. So sometimes they made a list, sometimes they gave a little bit more detail on certain names, but they didn't go too far since they didn't really know them too much. The military responsible who wrote these archives. From Akwesasne, couldn't associate any. From Kanehsatake, who lost an arm as mentioned on a pension list. One actually was associable from other correspondences and so on. So you really have to go through censuses, parish registers, correspondences, and try to make the equation, which is unfortunately sometimes a little bit speculative, whether it was another agent, a military responsible, not in knowledge of those people, of the names, how to spell them. And those killed and wounded mentioned in other correspondences, some not appearing, one appearing in Kahnawake, other ones not appearing, so on. If we take the other one, Paul, there's one appearing, you see, so it's very speculative, and also it's really good to expose those names to elders who speak Mohawks, because through the orthographic formulas that are now taught in classes in Kahnawake, Kanehsatake, and Akwesasne, back then it was written differently. Now they went along with a new formula. They all got along and specific formulas and pronunciation-wise and how to write it in a more official formula. So back then, with the ancient soundex-like perception, the way they wrote it, it's good to expose the names to an elder to see with what it could be associated with the names right now that we know. So really interesting. Sometimes they were more precise when there was a chief. So we see Nipissing chief in the middle, Gagegowicz, and he appeared in the 1825 census as Gagikowicz. That makes sense sound-wise, soundex-wise. Kisensik below was Kisinsik, who was an Algonquian chief, actually a Nipissing chief, and so on. So those that were wounded, again, interesting because there was a little bit more details in certain documents. They really wrote their understanding of autograph back then was pretty much a fiasco. Beaver Dam back then was written Beaver, B-I-V-E-R. Sounds like river perhaps, but it's at Beaver Dam, June 24th. I certified the surname Ignace Taguananon was wounded in action at River Dams. He says he cannot use / being wounded at two places. Isaac Leclerc, if I'm not confusing, I think he was attributed to the Iroquois militia of St. Regis, and also certain Algonquians of the Ottawa River. Another document, we do hereby certify that Kisinsik, sometimes Kisinsik, here Kinsinsik, the chief of the Nipissing Nation, wounded in the shoulder at the Battle of Beaver Dam. Louis Langlade was taking care of the Algonquian and the Nipissing. He was actually living in Two Mountains with Dominique Duchamp. Another document, I certified a Pierre Joseph, a chief of the Abenaki tribe of the Indian laborers, under a severe compound fracture of the arm occasioned by a musket ball, which he described as having received 4 months ago. The injury, I am of opinion, is sufficient for the cost of the limb for 1 year, so some sort of pension that he could receive and the medical backup. So it ended up that after the war, there was the rebellion of 1837-38. The tri-monthly donations that they gave to the veterans and their families, as I was saying, then the creation of reserves, it started to become, in French we say a fardeau. It was like a weight somehow to keep giving those tri-monthly to buy yearly gifts to the families. So the creation of reserves really put an end to the paternalistic hands of Canada military-wise and as two associate nations. And now people remain the pupils, the subjects of the crown, not having the status of major citizens, of free citizens, but they did remain as the wives had the women had the right to vote in 1940. The natives had the right to vote, became citizens in 1969. It was voted in 1969, but in Quebec, it was only put in motion at the election in 1973 or 76. So the first voting right. So that's about it. And for the Sulpicians, again, as I was saying previously, those from Kanehsatake, they didn't really take part a lot in the mission of the War of 1812. and even through the lacrosse newspaper stuff, we see Kahnawake taking part in many games of lacrosse, shows when the Queen comes and so on. But we only see the official games in which Kanehsatake, those from Two Mountains, around 1940. Until then, the Sulpicians, they really tried to erase what we could hear about the Mohawks in Kanehsatake, since many court cases appeared against them concerning the crown land, because it's the only crown land belonging to a religious order, which is a legal abyss up to now. So that was it for the those of Kahnawake and Kanehsatake mostly. All the archives, all the researches are online. Those that I made. Either you type my name, Eric Pouliot-Thisdale, 1812, or Voila website, Library and Archives Canada. And the War of 1812 is also on BA&Q Bibliothèque and Archives Nationales du Québec on their website. So, are there anybody with questions, perhaps?
Hi,
Hi.
Eric. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, it's Dwayne here. We do have a question. The first question's come in, and it is the following: to your knowledge, are there any soldiers involved in the War of 1812 who also fought in 1837 on the Patriot side?
Not on the Patriot side, though. Perhaps French Canadians, but to my knowledge, those from Kahnawake were working with the government of Canada against the Patriots. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Lorraine O'Donnell asks, within the Mohawk communities you have discussed today, are there any oral traditions of their ancestors' participation in the War of 1812?
Yeah. Actually, some people kept the medals, and there's also histories of women when their husband passed away that sold the medals, since there were certain periods economically that were very, very, very hard. So there are actual archives, correspondences, and oral traditions as well. I noticed through the Sherbrooke record at the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec, the BA&Q newspapers archives, there's actually a few testimonies of Abenakis and Hurons that their great-great-grandfathers took part in that war and so on. And they have pictures of the medals. There's actually a collector, how do you call these, scant?
I know.
Auction.
Auction.
The auctions, yeah. There's a veteran from Ontario who took part in, he was in the War of Vietnam. And he's a collector of items. And he sent me pictures of medals of the Battle of Chateauguay that he bought in an auction, actually.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah. Though he didn't want to be identified like many veterans from that period. So yeah, he sent me those pictures, and it's very interesting. We spoke for quite a while, and he told me that he encountered in a few auctions, actually, some of those medals from the Battle of Chateauguay. Yeah. So in the newspapers articles, there's a few histories of widows and grandchildren exposing the medals of their family. Yeah.
I see another question here. I'm going to read it. It's from Joe Graham. Hi, Eric.
Yeah.
What did you call the military Indigenous company? And the second part of that question is, how would they have seen themselves, as allies or as members of British forces?
Yeah, well, they were qualified as the warrior militia, and it's very from Upper Canada to Lower Canada, there's various positions, and there was a chief in Akwesasne who was previously from Kahnawake, was named Charles Cook, who was he was from a black father and an Abenaki mother. He was adopted, and he was very charismatic. He became chief in Akwesasne, and he did try to convince the Mohawks from the part of Lower Canada not to take part, to stay neutral, since they were going to have to go fight, people from the militia with the American side and so on. So, and it might also be a reason why a lot from Two Mountains didn't take part in that war. But it's a huge speculation. Uh, but though, yes, many didn't retrieve, uh, they didn't want to take part in that war. But the Dominion of Canada, they kept pushing on that they were keep on going with offering their protection to all the allies of Upper and Lower Canada. So the Mohawks did go on with the Voltigeurs and so on. But yeah, of course, some deserted. Some there's not a lot of archives concerning that. It's, it
Doug
would be
Brown.
interesting to go further with that.
Doug Brown asked you, Eric. Doug Brown wants to know: were there Native militia on the American side of the war?
Yes, there was. Yeah. And actually, Cook from Akwesasne, who tried to convince all the the Six Nations then not to take part in that war. He actually took part in it with the Americans. So yes, there was it really divided the Six Nations.
I have just a quick comment to make.
Yep.
Listening to you speak and knowing very, very little about these actual wars, there is one name that stands out, and I don't know if this would be a path into the subject for those who wanted to pursue the subject of Indigenous military heritage, but right here in the townships,
Yep.
The local historical society in the city of Drummondville identifies Frederick Harriet as one of their local pioneer important names. Well, Frederick Harriet was a major who led a division of the Voltigeurs, and he had about a dozen Mohawks under his command, as it were, during the Battle of Chrysler Farm.
Uh-huh.
So local history societies can actually could get at some of this story, I think, maybe, speculating, in the papers or documents that they may have in their possession, which flow from the non-Indigenous commanders of these units. Just a thought. I don't know. I've never thought to do that, but
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yeah, I think through the newspapers archives, because at BANQ, Bibliothèque Archives Nationales du Québec, they have newspapers online since the Montreal Herald from the 1700s, the end of the 1700s. So I'm pretty sure because they have all the ministries of the Chamber of Commons, they were all put on the Montreal Herald back then. Yeah.
Another question here coming from Tyler Wood. Given the number of warriors that you've identified in your presentation, do you have any idea what proportion they represent of the adult male population in these Indigenous communities?
It is an absolute speculation. When I was doing the research for the school in Kanehsatake, the cultural center, then somebody was pushing the idea that probably all the men from 14 years old to 30 to 40 were part of the militia. Though there's none men, or a very, very, very few mentioned in the parish in the military archives, and those who received medals, there's none, or two to four, So it's an absolute speculation up to now, Yeah.
One final question, I think, before we wrap things up. Are there any indigenous historical associations that, that would have done some work to organize this information or other on other subjects and topics? This question
Well,
comes from Lorraine.
actually, there's a group that was created. It's called the Conference on Iroquois Research. That's conducting meeting once a year, a whole weekend, and it's all university researchers, teachers, and various researchers through our historical archives that expose either their publications or their researches and so on. And it's been on since it's going to be the 73rd year this year. So it's been on for 73 years, or something like that, 72 to 75 years. And so, yeah, it's been. So if you Google Conference on Iroquois Research, you'll find everything. I'm actually managing the page there for the membership there. I don't have the whole history of the foundation, but it was, of course, back then it was universitarians, Europeans that started it. And since about 10 to 20 years, there's people from Akwesasne and Kahnawake and Kanehsatake taking part in the conferences and so on. So, yeah, very interesting.
That's really good to know. We're going to leave it there. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. And of course, special thanks to our guest, Eric. Thank you
thanks,
so much for being with us.
Thank you, Dwayne.
And
Thanks, everybody.
we will talk later, I hope. And look for Eric's article in the fall Quebec Heritage News Magazine, the fall edition. Eric's one of our featured writers.
Well,
Bye
thank
now.
you again. Bye now. Thank you.